The equilibrium of integrity. The hum of the HVAC compressor cycling on in the crawl space above our modest Houston home had, over the years, become something closer to a lullaby than a mechanical nuisance. A low, steady baritone that hummed beneath every important thought I had ever had in that house. For a decade, Emma and I had built a life within these unremarkable walls. Quiet, deliberate, stitched together by a mutual respect that required no extravagant declarations to prove itself. Emma taught third grade with a patience that seemed to have no floor, and she had long ago learned to read the topography of my silences the way a seismologist reads a fault line. She knew that when my hands fell still on the edge of the dinner table and my gaze drifted toward the window, unfocused and distant, I was not daydreaming. I was balancing equations somewhere behind my eyes, wrestling a reactor design into submission. I had given my working life to renewable energy with something bordering on devotion. During my doctoral years at a prominent Texas university, I slept in fragments and dreamed, quite literally, in catalysts and rate constants, until the boundary between my waking calculations and my unconscious ones dissolved entirely. Out of those sleepless years came several patents that never felt like legal instruments to me. They felt like small, stubborn acts of faith, my modest signature scrawled across the margin of a cleaner future. My proudest achievement among them was a process for biohydrocarbon production through rapid pyrolysis of agricultural waste, paired with a hydrodeoxygenation step driven by catalytic hydrogen transfer, chemistry that turned discarded stalks and husks into something that could, quite plausibly, fuel an airplane. 10 years ago, I carried that body of work through the glass doors of Green Dome Engineering, an EPC firm perched at the intersection of ambition and pragmatism, where I rose steadily to the rank of engineering manager. For 8 of those 10 years, I freely folded my patents into our designs without asking for a single dollar in royalty, operating on the quiet conviction that a rising tide lifts every boat moored beside it, including, I had naively assumed, my own. Then 2 years ago, the tide curdled into something closer to a swamp, thick and stagnant, the moment Brian Gadruin was installed as our new technical director. Brian wore authority the way some men wear a suit 2 sizes too small, straining at the seams, cinched tight around a frame it was never built to fit. He masked a hollow technical core with the polished cadence of corporate grandstanding, and with a slow, patient, almost surgical persistence, he had spent 2 years quietly relabeling my thinking as his own. I can trace the precise moment I first understood what Brian was capable of, and it did not announce itself with any drama at all. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of dry erase marker and reheated coffee. We had been wrestling for weeks with a stubborn problem on an early iteration of the GreenDocs process. The hydrodeoxygenation catalyst kept losing activity faster than our economics could tolerate, poisoned by the water generated as a byproduct of its own reaction. It was the kind of problem that keeps an engineer awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while the mass balance runs itself in the dark behind his eyes. I remember the evening it finally resolved itself in my mind. Not in the office, but at our kitchen table, watching Emma wring a dish towel dry over the sink, the water twisting free from the fabric in a slow, deliberate spiral. Something in that ordinary motion clicked a key into a lock I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The following morning, in that same windowless conference room, I stood at the whiteboard with a marker in my hand and something close to elation humming beneath my sternum. The particular, unguarded joy of a man who has just watched an idea solve itself. I sketched it out for the team. A 2-stage reactor configuration with an intermediate water stripping step, pulling the byproduct water out of the process stream between stages before it ever had the chance to linger against the catalyst bed long enough to deactivate it. It was elegant in the way good engineering is always elegant. Not complicated, just correctly aimed. I explained the vapor-liquid equilibrium behind it, sketched the flow diagram in quick, confident strokes, and felt, for perhaps 20 full minutes, the pure and uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem yielding to patient thought. Brian sat at the far end of the table throughout my explanation, saying almost nothing. I noticed it even then, though I did not yet understand its weight. The particular stillness of him, elbows planted on the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in something closer to appraisal, the look of a man cataloging rather than absorbing. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them precise, both of them the kind of question a man asks when he intends to remember the answer rather than understand it in the moment. 3 weeks later, at the quarterly leadership town hall, I sat in the 3rd row of folding chairs while Brian stood at the podium beneath the projector's cold blue light, presenting our division's innovation highlights to an audience of 200 employees and a handful of corporate executives flown in from out of state. And there it was, projected 8 feet wide on the screen behind him. My 2-stage water stripping configuration, redrawn in Green Dome's corporate template, captioned with a phrase that landed in my chest like a dropped wrench, a strategic process insight developed under my technical direction. I felt the blood drain from my face in a single, cold rush, followed almost immediately by a flush of heat crawling up the back of my neck, the particular physiological betrayal of a body reacting to injustice before the mind is finished deciding how to respond. My jaw tightened until I could feel the muscle jump faintly at my temple. My hands, resting on my knees, curled slowly into fists I did not consciously order them to make. Beside me, one of my own engineers, a sharp young woman named Priya, who had been in that windowless conference room 3 weeks earlier, turned her head toward me with her eyebrows drawn together in open disbelief, her mouth parting as though to say something before catching herself, glancing instead at the exits and the executives seated near the front, calculating, as I was, the cost of speaking up in a room built entirely for Brian's benefit. I did not stand. I did not object. I sat with my spine rigid and my expression schooled into the flat, professional neutrality I'd spent a career cultivating, while 200 people applauded an idea that had come to me over a dish towel and a sink full of water, in a kitchen Brian had never once set foot inside. Afterward, in the parking lot, Priya caught up with me, her voice low and urgent, still vibrating with the particular indignation of the young, those who have not yet learned to swallow it. "That was yours," she said, not as a question. "James, that was entirely yours." "I know," I told her, and I remember how strange the words felt in my mouth, calm, level, and entirely at odds with the slow, corrosive anger settling into my chest like sediment finding the bottom of a still pond. "Write it down anyway. Everything. Dates, drawings, who was in the room. Someday it will matter." It would be 2 more years before it did. The true reckoning began with the Green Docks project, an ambitious undertaking to design a facility capable of converting wheat and corn agricultural residue into ethanol and aviation-grade jet fuel. The client, well acquainted with my working reputation and the papers bearing my name, specifically requested that I lead the engineering charge. I assembled a formidable 20-person multidisciplinary team, and even now I can summon each of their faces without effort, the way an engineer remembers the load path of a structure he built with his own hands. Priya anchored the process design alongside David Chun and Patricia Sanchez, the 3 of them forming a kind of quiet, relentless engine room at the center of the project. Priya with her habit of tapping a pencil against her teeth when a mass balance refused to close, David with the unshakable calm of a man who had watched 100 simulations converge and trusted the 101st would too, and Patricia with her sharp, darting eyes that caught unit inconsistencies before they ever made it onto a PNID. Robert Kennedy ran control and instrumentation with the fastidious, almost monkish patience of a man who believed, quite sincerely, that no plant had ever exploded because of an equation, only because someone had failed to trust the instrument reading it. Ali Musso walked the piping isometrics with a rolled-up drawing perpetually tucked beneath his arm, muttering under his breath about pipe stress and thermal expansion the way other men might mutter a prayer. And Rita Thompson, our mechanical lead, had a laugh that could be heard 3 cubicles away and a stubbornness to match it. She once redlined a vendor's pump curve 4 separate times rather than let a marginal design pass under her signature. For 6 grueling months, we poured something close to our collective soul into the front-end engineering design. There were nights I left the office only when the janitorial staff politely reminded me the building needed to be locked. Nights Emma left a plate of dinner covered on the counter because she had already gone to bed by the time my key finally turned in the door. And there were nights I would pass the conference room at 9, 10, 11 o'clock and find Priya and David still hunched over a stubborn convergence error, or Robert quietly recalibrating a control loop diagram for the 4th time that week, refusing, every one of them, to let a single loose thread leave our hands unresolved. But Brian had been quietly architecting a different structure altogether, one built not of steel and process flow diagrams, but of nepotism disguised as opportunity. He maneuvered his son, Malcolm, a young chemical engineer whose self-assurance vastly outpaced his competence, into the role of project manager, framing the appointment to the executive board as a chance for the boy to gain experience. I had watched it happen with the particular, helpless clarity of a man observing a slow-motion structural failure, visible, inevitable, and entirely out of his hands to stop. I remember, in the weeks leading up to that final Tuesday, noticing a peculiar shift in the office atmosphere, the kind of subtle pressure change a chemical engineer learns to distrust instinctively, the way a boiler operator distrusts a gauge that reads suspiciously steady. Conversations near the coffee station would trail off half a beat too soon when I approached. Malcolm had taken to lingering by my office door with a studied casualness, asking questions about the feed package whose answers he already had access to, as though rehearsing a familiarity with material he had never once earned the right to understand. I noted it, filed it away the way I file away an anomalous data point, unexplained but not yet actionable, and returned my attention to the reactor design because the chemistry, at least, never lied to me. The tipping point arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, humid even by Houston's forgiving standards, the kind of heat that seems to press against the windows from the outside like a physical weight. The feed package sat complete on the share drive, polished, cross-checked, ready for the pivotal client presentation scheduled that same afternoon. I remember feeling, that morning, an unusual and unearned lightness in my chest, the particular satisfaction of watching 6 months of labor finally converge into something solid and defensible. It did not last past 10 o'clock. My phone buzzed against the desk with the particular urgency of summons. It was Brian's executive assistant, and the message was terse. He wanted to see me in his office. Now. The moment I stepped through the door, the air itself seemed to thicken, choked with the sterile, cloying scent of new leather and old pretense. Brian was reclined in his executive chair, fingers laced together over the modest swell of his stomach, his face arranged into an opaque, rehearsed smile, the kind of expression a man practices in a mirror rather than one that arrives on its own. But it was not Brian who first commanded my attention. In the corner chair sat Victoria Vance, the Chief Human Resources Officer, her spine held as straight and unyielding as a length of rebar, her jaw locked into a severe, immovable line. Behind the glint of her designer spectacles, her eyes gave away nothing at all, which somehow gave away everything. My stomach dropped, not the queasy lurch of surprise, but the colder, more analytical alarm of a man watching a pressure gauge climb past its rated limit. I felt the muscles across my shoulder blades tighten instinctively, an old animal reflex bracing for impact before my conscious mind had even finished parsing the room. "Sit down, James," Brian said, his voice slicked with a camaraderie so manufactured it made the hair along my forearms rise. He gestured toward the chair across from him with a slow, dismissive wave, as though granting me a favor. I remained standing, my boots planted firmly against the hardwood, and crossed my arms over my chest, a deliberate, physical wall raised between us. I looked him dead in the eye. "I prefer to stand, Brian. What's this about?" "The Green Dive presentation is in 2 hours, and my team is putting the final polish on the feed package." Brian's smile widened without ever once reaching his eyes. He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us with a deliberate encroachment into my space. Actually, James, that's precisely what we need to discuss. There's been a structural adjustment to the presentation lineup. Malcolm will be delivering the feed layout to the client's executive board this afternoon. A sudden, sharp heat crawled up the back of my neck, flushing into my ears. My hands dropped to my sides of their own accord, fists clenching so tightly that my knuckles blanched a stark, bloodless white. "Malcolm," I asked, my voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a decade of quietly banked indignation now finally given a place to go. "Malcolm hasn't opened a single mass balance sheet in 3 weeks. He doesn't understand the reaction kinetics of the hydrodeoxygenation reactor well enough to defend it for 30 seconds, let alone 30 minutes. From the corner, Victoria Vance shifted in her seat. The sharp clack of her pen, striking her notepad, sliced through the tension like a blade through taut fabric. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her frames. Her voice sanded down to something entirely devoid of warmth. "James, let's keep our emotions in check. This is a strategic corporate decision. We need a fresh, dynamic face to lead the presentation." I turned my gaze to her, my chest rising and falling more heavily now as my breathing deepened, each exhale controlled, deliberate, a man consciously refusing to let his pulse dictate his words. "A fresh face? Victoria, this isn't a marketing campaign. This is a highly complex, multi-million-dollar chemical engineering design. My team worked 80-hour weeks for 6 months to build it." Brian rose from his chair, drawing himself up to his full height in an obvious bid for physical dominance, shoulders thrown back, chest expanding as he leveled a manicured finger directly at my sternum. The pleasant facade dissolved entirely, replaced by something sharper, more predatory. "Let's be entirely clear, James. You are to hand over all project leadership documentation, digital access credentials, and presentation rights to Malcolm, effective immediately. Do not make this difficult for yourself." What washed over me then was not panic but a profound, heavy stillness. The particular calm, I would later think, that settles over an engineer in the half-second before a structural failure, when the numbers have already told you what is about to happen, and there is nothing left to do but watch it arrive. I stepped closer to the desk, flattening my palms against the cool mahogany, leaning in until I could see the faint, anxious twitch pulling at the corner of Brian's left eyelid, a tell he had never quite managed to control, not in 2 years of watching him lie in board meetings. "You are robbing me, Brian," I said, my voice dropped to something quiet and level, each word weighted with an unhurried, absolute conviction. "You have stolen my ideas for 2 years and called it simplification. But I will not stand here and let you paste your son's name over my life's work. I refuse." Victoria Vance rose instantly, her heels striking the floor in sharp, staccato clicks as she stepped between us, her face flushing with a sudden, blotchy anger that cracked straight through her corporate composure. She snatched a folder from the desk and held it in front of her like a shield, or perhaps a weapon. "James, your blatant refusal to comply constitutes gross insubordination and a direct violation of company policy. If you do not hand over those files right now, we will terminate your employment immediately, for cause, and without a single dollar of severance." I looked at Victoria's furious, sterile glare, and then at Brian, whose smug, triumphant smirk had crept back across his face. He believed, in that moment, that he had cornered an academic into a paycheck's silent submission. He believed a man who lived simply, without extravagance, would beg to keep his salary rather than lose his name. A slow, humorless smile crept across my own face instead. I straightened, adjusted the cuffs of my button-down shirt with unhurried precision, and felt for the first time in 2 years an overwhelming and unfamiliar sense of liberation loosen something tight in my chest. "Then fire me," I said quietly. The walk out of the Green Dome building was the longest of my professional life. The blazing Houston heat struck my face like an open hand as I carried a single cardboard box of personal effect across the parking lot to my car. A stapler, a framed photograph, a mug Emma had given me years ago that Red World's okayest chemical engineer. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my knees had gone unaccountably weak, the full gravity of what had just happened finally settling into my bones like sediment finding the bottom of a still pond. Emma was in the kitchen, grading a stack of spelling tests to the table. The moment she heard the door, she looked up. Seeing the box cradled in my arms, her pen slipped from her fingers and rolled unheeded across the table. Her eyes widened, tracking the tight, exhausted line of my mouth and the uncharacteristic slump that had settled into my shoulders she had never once in 10 years seen bow. She did not ask a flurry of panicked questions. Instead, she rose smoothly, crossed the room, and lifted the box from my hands, setting it down on the floor without ceremony. Then she wrapped her arms around my waist and pressed her face into my chest. I collapsed into the embrace, my chin coming to rest against her shoulder, my eyes squeezing shut as a long, shuddering breath finally escaped me, a breath I had apparently been holding since I first stepped into Brian's office. "Tell me," she murmured softly against my shirt. The house had gone quiet around us in that particular way it does at the end of the afternoon, the light through the kitchen window softening from white to gold, dust motes drifting lazily above the table like suspended particulates in a still reactor. I could hear, faintly, the neighbor's sprinkler system ticking on somewhere across the fence. An ordinary sound from an ordinary evening, entirely indifferent to the fact that my professional life had just been dismantled 2 hours earlier by a man who did not understand a single reaction he claimed to own. We sat together at our worn wooden kitchen table, hands intertwined, and as I recounted the viciousness of that boardroom, my voice trembled with a rare and raw vulnerability I rarely allowed myself to show, even to her. I felt stripped down to something smaller than the professional identity I had spent a decade constructing, exposed the way a beam looks once the drywall has been pulled away and every load path is suddenly visible. "They took everything, Emma," I whispered, staring down at our joined hands rather than at her face. 10 years, gone in 10 minutes, because I wouldn't let them steal my dignity along with everything else. Emma squeezed my fingers, her grip surprisingly and fiercely tight. I looked up, and the expression waiting for me on her face took the breath clean out of my chest. Her eyes were blazing, not with fear, not with resentment, but with a profound and unwavering respect that seemed to fill the entire kitchen. "James, look at me," she said, her chin lifting with a quiet, unshakable pride. "They stole your labor. They cannot steal your mind. We have lived simply because we chose to, not because we had no other option. We don't need their titles. We certainly don't need their money. We have our integrity, and no executive on any board can fire you from who you are." Her words landed like a catalyst dropped into a supersaturated solution, and the emotional fog clouding my analytical mind began, almost instantly, to crystallize into something clear. I blinked. My posture straightened as a sudden, sharp realization sparked to life behind my eyes. "They forgot," I whispered, a low, disbelieving laugh bubbling up in my throat before I could stop it. Emma tilted her head, her eyebrows knitting together in gentle confusion. "Forgot what, honey?" "The patents," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word, the familiar spark of strategic calculation rekindling behind my eyes. Brian and Victoria operate under the comfortable delusion that everything inside my head belongs to Green Dome. But my core biomass processing patents were granted before my tenure there, during my doctoral research, years before I ever set foot in that building. For 8 years, I let them use those processes free of charge, on nothing more than a verbal understanding between colleagues. That agreement just walked out the door with me, in a cardboard box, along with a mug about being the world's okayest engineer. What unfolded over the following 2 weeks was, in its own grim way, a masterclass in systemic collapse, the kind of controlled demolition an engineer studies afterward not with satisfaction, but with the clinical curiosity of understanding exactly which member failed first and why. While my intellectual property attorney and I quietly filed for an immediate federal injunction to cease and desist all use of my patented pyrolysis and hydrogen transfer technologies, Green Dome, blind to the crack already spreading through its own foundation, marched forward into the Green Docs client presentation as though nothing at all had changed. Later, one of my former lead engineers texted me a play-by-play of exactly what transpired in that high-stakes meeting, and I have replayed the account in my mind so many times since that it has taken on the vivid, unmistakable texture of memory, though I was never in the room. Malcolm Gudrun stood at the head of the grand conference room in a bespoke suit that fit him better than his understanding of the process ever would, his posture radiating a hollow, unearned confidence. Shoulders back, chin lifted, the practice bearing a man who has rehearsed looking capable far more than he has rehearsed being capable. But confidence, as any engineer eventually learns, cannot substitute for chemical kinetics. The collapse began the moment the client's chief technical officer, a seasoned veteran who had spent 30 years learning to smell a badly designed reactor the way a sommelier smells a corked bottle of wine, interrupted the slide deck with a single, quiet, devastating question. "Mr. Gudrun," the client had asked, leaning forward, one eyebrow arched into a deep, skeptical furrow. The mass balance on page 42 shows a yield that's essentially impossible given the oxygen content of the corn stover feedstock. How exactly does your hydrodeoxygenation catalyst handle the water byproduct without deactivating within the first operating cycle? Malcolm froze. The smug half-smile drained from his face in an instant, replaced by something closer to stark, animal terror. His jaw fell open a fraction, his eyes darting frantically from the client to his father to the slide behind him, like a man searching for an exit that had quietly sealed itself shut. He cleared his throat, reaching with a visibly trembling hand for a glass of water, spilling a thin scatter of drops across his pristine notes. We've engineered a proprietary buffer system," he stammered, his voice cracking down the middle of the sentence. "My father can elaborate further." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a dark, furious flush climbing from his collar toward his ears. He attempted to salvage the wreckage with a flurry of hollow corporate language, throwing his hands up in a broad, defensive gesture that convinced no one in the room. "What my son means to say is that the process is highly proprietary. Green Dome holds the operational framework under strict confidentiality." The client CTO did not so much as blink. He closed his laptop with a sharp, echoing snap that seemed to punctuate the entire meeting. "We don't buy buzzwords, Brian. We buy functioning engineering. And frankly, this design bears every hallmark of Dr. James Stapletone's published research." Where is he? 48 hours later, our legal injunction landed on the desks of Green Dome's board of directors with the force of a thunderclap. The filing stated, in unambiguous language, that any continued use of the rapid pyrolysis and hydrodeoxygenation processes described in the feed package constituted direct federal patent infringement. Without my patents, the entire Green Docs design was quite simply an illegal and unbuildable stack of paper. Engineering fiction dressed up in the language of a deliverable. I did not celebrate when my attorney called to confirm the filing had been formally received. I remember sitting instead in my study for a long while, turning a pen slowly between my fingers, feeling something closer to a quiet, clinical satisfaction than to triumph. The same feeling, I imagine, that a structural engineer feels upon confirming that a bridge he warned would fail has, in fact, failed exactly along the fault line he predicted. There is no joy in being right about a collapse. There is only the cold, steady comfort of having understood the mathematics correctly all along. Corporate survival instinct, I have come to learn, is a swift and utterly merciless thing once its own extinction becomes visible on the horizon. On Friday evening, as Emma and I stood shoulder to shoulder at the stove preparing dinner, my phone rang, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar corporate number. I pressed answer and set on speaker between the salt shaker and the cutting board. Dr. Stapleton? This is Arthur Sterling, chairman of the board at Green Dome. The man's voice, which I had heard boom with dictatorial confidence across countless town halls, now sounded strangely hollowed out, laced with a desperate, heavy exhaustion I had never once associated with him. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, keeping my face carefully neutral, even though no one but Emma could see it. Good evening, Mr. Sterling. To what do I owe the call? I believe my attorney made our position perfectly clear in the filing. A heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. James, I'm calling to offer a sincere and unreserved apology on behalf of the entire board. The actions of Brian Gadroon and Victoria Vance were entirely abhorrent and a flagrant violation of everything this company claims to stand for. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossing one ankle over the other, watching Emma's small, knowing smile from across the room. They both seemed quite convinced they were acting in Green Dome's best interest, Mr. Sterling. They were fools, Sterling snapped, his voice flashing with a brief, residual anger before receding again into weariness. As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, Brian Gadroon and his son Malcolm have been terminated for gross misconduct, their names stripped from every internal document and public asset. Victoria Vance has been forced to resign, effective immediately. We have cleared out the rot, James. All of it. I let the silence stretch across the line for a long moment. A deliberate tactical pause, the same one I would use on a control system to test how much pressure it could actually hold before it told the truth about its limits. I could hear Sterling's shallow, anxious breathing on the other end, waiting. And what is it you want from me, Mr. Sterling? I asked quietly. We need you to come home, James, Sterling said, his tone stripped down to something entirely humbled, the bravado I had once heard him wield in company town halls now nowhere to be found. The board has voted unanimously to offer you the position of technical director, taking Brian's seat on the executive board. We're prepared to give you full technical autonomy and a complete restructuring of your compensation. And regarding the patents, he paused, and I could hear him draw a breath, the way a man does before committing to something he knows he cannot walk back. The board wishes to formally purchase a license to your process technology. Not the arrangement we had before, James. A proper one. Whatever royalty structure you deem fair, whatever terms you set, we will sign them as written. You define the number. We will not negotiate it down by so much as a percentage point. Please, the Green Docs project, and frankly, this company's future, cannot survive without you. I let the silence stretch a moment longer, turning the offer over in my mind the way I might turn over a set of design parameters before trusting them. Checking for the hidden qualifier, the fine print that would quietly erode what sounded, on its surface, unconditional. There was none. Sterling had said it plainly. You define the number. For the first time since I had walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box and a bruised sense of dignity, I felt something other than vindication settle into my chest. I felt quite simply valued on my own terms. I'll draft the licensing terms myself. Then, Mr. Sterling, I said, my attorney will have the royalty structure and the technology license agreement ready for the board's review by Monday morning. If Green Dome signs it as written, I'll see you Tuesday. As I sit at my desk tonight, looking out over the scattered, twinkling lights of the Houston skyline, a deep and resonant peace settles into my chest. The particular quiet of a system finally returned to equilibrium after a long and violent disturbance. Tomorrow I return to Green Dome Engineering, not as a disposable component in someone else's machine, but as the architect of its technical destiny. This ordeal has reaffirmed something every true practitioner of our craft must never let himself forget. Engineering is not merely the cold manipulation of matter, equations, and molecular structure. It is the manifestation of human intellect, dedication, and unyielding integrity, made physical in steel and process and product. True success is never built by exploiting the labor of others, nor manufactured through political maneuvering in a corporate corridor. It is built slowly and deliberately on a foundation of mutual respect, ethical rigor, and genuine collaboration. Forces can be misdirected for a season. Ideas can be borrowed or stolen or quietly relabeled. But in the grand, immutable equations that govern a life honestly lived, truth and merit will always, eventually, find their equilibrium.